You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Thibault Schrepel. Today we're going to be talking about the relationship between blockchain and antitrust law. Thibault, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Hi, thanks a lot for having me.
So this is an interesting topic. I've sort of avoided doing a lot of episodes about Bitcoin and blockchain. I have done, I think, at least one talking about it, but I figure there are just a lot of people talking about Bitcoin in a lot of places, and most people at this point have probably heard of it. They understand that, you know, it's an online money, it's decentralized. But what your research deals with is the fact that this technology, this blockchain technology, can be more than just a ledger for keeping track of money or transactions. It can also do much more than that. It can be a way of organizing organizations. So tell me a little bit about blockchain and how it can be. Well, first, just generally, what is a blockchain? How does it work, and how can it tie into something like antitrust, which I think is related to its potential to run organizations?
Sure. So a blockchain, well, obviously you have a lot of different definitions on the internet. What it is basically is a ledger which is shared and that anyone in principle can access and write information on. What you really have is, I would say, 3 generations of blockchain. The one which I will call blockchain 1.0 is, so you do have the ledger, and on top of it, you have applications running. This is really important, in my opinion, to make the distinction between the blockchain itself, which could be useful. For instance, we could write information on that blockchain. I could write the information that right now we are having a phone conversation, but the main utility of blockchain is the application running on top of it. So blockchain 1.0 is cryptocurrencies. So you do have, obviously, Bitcoin. That's the most famous one. So the way it works is really a currency, and every time there is a transaction using Bitcoin, that transaction is registered on the blockchain. Then you have blockchain 2.0. Blockchain 2.0 is the next generation of blockchain, in a sense, which is smart contracts. So now, smart contracts aren't smart and they are not contracts. What they are really is a transaction between two parties. So it could just be the fact that, for instance, you agree to do something for me, and we have terms for that agreement, and that is a smart contract. Or it could be, for instance, the fact that I'm going to do something for you, and you will, in exchange, give me money for that. So in that sense, you really have blockchain 1.0, which is currencies, and 2.0, which is the service that you are or I am providing. And the third kind of blockchain 3.0, is the new type of applications which are developed right now. So it could basically be everything. And it does already exist, which is quite surprising. So it could be app, messenger. It could be a new kind of taxi company. It could be basically everything. And the way it works is the same as blockchain 2.0, which is, for instance, I share on the blockchain my location. Then that information is public. And if you drive a cab, then you can see that and you can pick me at the location where I am. And that is registered on the blockchain. So really, you do have the blockchain itself and the application running on top of it. The idea being that every transaction, whether it is blockchain 1.0, 2, or 3, is registered on the blockchain. And in principle, it cannot be modified, which is the main utility of the blockchain because you can trust the ledger as being original and being complete.
Yeah, could you explain the Byzantine generals problem? That's a sort of math problem relevant to this and other computing problems, and you talk about it in your research.
Of course. So first, I'm a legal trained lawyer and legal academic, and that is a problem, obviously, that we do have when we do research, which isn't only legal issues, which is that it is really difficult, at least for me, to understand the math and all of the calculation. So the way I understand the Byzantine general problem is basically the idea that if you do not have one single party which is coordinating all the parties toward a single goal, then that won't happen. And it's an analogy which is really old at the time of war. And if you do not have a general who could actually reach all of the soldiers at the same time and say, hey, let's go that way because it is the best strategy, then it won't happen. And the blockchain solved that because you do not have anyone running the blockchain. The people running the blockchain is all of the users at the same time. And they do work in a way toward a single objective, which is making the application effective. So it's basically, it is really important also for economic research, because without any person on top of the blockchain is achieving something that usually in the societies as we know it is happening because one person is basically the pilot on the plane. In a sense, you do not have any pilot on the plane on blockchain. It's all of the users working toward a single objective because of the way the technology is designed.
Yeah, the way I understand the Byzantine generals problem is it's trying to coordinate when you have potentially bad actors trying to stop you from coordinating, and potential difficulties with being able to send messages to the people you're trying to coordinate with. And you're right, blockchain is a way to for one thing make it so a single bad actor or a small number of bad actors can't mislead or change the ledger, and at the same time allowing people who are acting in good faith or to all coordinate with each other using this public ledger. And you mentioned that one of the more advanced uses of blockchain would be to set up something like an Uber or Lyft, but without any central system or server running it, but just a decentralized network at the sort of doing it. And I've heard people suggest having entire firms where the the buying and selling of shares and then voting on the behavior of the firm, to hire or fire a new CEO or something like that, could all be set up through a blockchain. And then without a central person or group of people to hold accountable, the firm is potentially difficult to prosecute. And tell me how that ties into your research.
So actually, that is one of the main legal issue, which is that blockchain could be used within existing companies. So you do have a company and you could say, well, I don't really like the way it functions, so I will use blockchain and I will implement new voting system and et cetera, et cetera. Or blockchain could be used to create something new, a new service which is actually competing with existing companies. The main issue that we have right now is that blockchain is a technology. It isn't a legal entity. So you do have all of those users. They are coming to the blockchain, using it in a certain way, and still it doesn't create a legal entity. So what do you do as a judge, for instance, if you say, well, that blockchain did something bad, which is prohibited? Yes, but do you actually sanction the users? Do you sanction the people which have created the blockchain? Do you sanction the people which funded the blockchain? So we don't have any answers right now, which is the reason why it is really exciting. And so basically, this ties to my research. The idea is to say that antitrust, as the name indicates, really is about anti-monopolies. It is being anti-trustees. And with the blockchain technology, you do not have any trustees. So in a way, you could argue that blockchain is solving antitrust, is reaching the goal that antitrust is trying to achieve for almost 150 years. So that creates two kind of issues. The first is that what do we do? Is blockchain a way to organize markets better? And so do we still need antitrust enforcement? And if we do, to what extent? And how can we use antitrust on blockchain?
Yeah, you can imagine a corporation set up in a decentralized way. And you can imagine it gaining a dominant market position, outcompeting all its competitors, maybe finding ways. Of course, not. It wouldn't be the blockchain or anything non-corporeal doing it. It would be people employed through this organization structure doing it. But you can imagine a situation where that entity would do something that we would normally think is, that is somehow illegal, and then the prosecution being difficult or impossible because it's not clear who has done, what person has done the illegal thing and could be held to account for it. Is that roughly the point you're making?
It is. So you do have three different levels of legal issues. The first is within blockchain. How do you identify illegal practices? Is there a way for you as a regulator to actually identify those practices? Because which I haven't mentioned yet is that all of the transactions on blockchain could be public, which is public blockchains. But you do also have another kind of blockchain, which is private blockchains. And on those blockchain, you can basically, when you create the blockchain, choose any settings that you prefer. So you might say, I want all of my transactions to be encrypted. I want those users to be able to see that part of the blockchain, but not the other part. You can basically choose the way you want your blockchain to operate, and you can change that anytime. So you do have three difficulties. The first being, especially for private blockchain, how do you identify illegal practices? Then if you are able to do so, the second difficulty is, how do you identify the authors of those practices? And the third difficulty, if you are able to first identify the practice, secondly, the person, the user, which has implemented that practice, is what do you do about it? So if you, in your example, if you do have a known company which is using blockchain, well, the first difficulty is kind of solved in a way. And you do have a lot of cases about employees. In some cases, they did something which is illegal. Is the employee liable, or is it the company? We do know how to address that issue pretty well. So, and it would be the same for blockchain. You would say, well, although it is a employee which did something anti-competitive using the blockchain, well, the company is liable for that employee. So that is solved. But then what do you do about it? And the main issue we may have, in my opinion, is that those smart contracts and blockchain 3.0, which is applications, they may be able to operate and to keep running without anyone behind it. So you could say, well, I've created a smart contract. For instance, it could be an agreement between us that I will do something for you, and in exchange, you give me some money. And once you have put those conditions on the blockchain, if you design your contract without any possibility of intervening on the contract and saying at any time we may stop the contract, then it becomes a code, and then it might be impossible for you to stop the contract running. So you do really have a new kind of issue for judges and authorities, which is, well, I know who did something anti-competitive or illegal. It could be also criminal cases, for instance. I spotted the practice, but then what can I do about it? And that is a really new kind of problem, which really doesn't exist outside of the blockchain world.
Right. So I couldn't take if there was a contract, but maybe I didn't know what I was agreeing to, or I didn't have the authority to make a certain deal that I made. I couldn't then, have a court declare the contract null if it was made through this system that is potentially, not reversible or not under my control once it's created.
Exactly. And that is the reason why you do have a very small amount of research paper arguing for best practices, some of which could be, well, if you do design a smart contract, you need to be aware of that risk. And so you need to enclose the possibility for you to anytime stop the contract running. Otherwise, it might be impossible to do so, which could be problematic, obviously.
But that might defeat part of the appeal of the contract. That you might want your contract to be unbreakable because you might want to make a pre-commitment. Maybe what you'd want instead is an ability to nullify the contract by mutual agreement.
Well, it could be. It could be also in your best advantage to, for instance, if it's a supply agreement, you may want to say, well, if that kind of prices raise during the contract, then the terms of the contract are automatically changing, which is one of the main reason why you may want to use smart contracts. But yes, also you might want to say, I want that contract to be written in stone, and I want that contract to be unstoppable. And it is actually what several blockchain technologies are arguing for. If you go on some of those websites, you see that they actually say, we create unstoppable applications, which are kind of smart contracts. So you're right. It is one of the main reasons why you may want to use blockchain. And so issues will arise regarding that matter. That is for sure. You won't have a market with a smart contract that you can enter as a regulator. Some of them will give you that possibility, and others will be unstoppable.
Yeah, it's not unlike a money order in the traditional banking system where, unlike a check, a money order is a stronger commitment to pay because the money, the bank, as soon as you make the money order, the bank sets aside the money and then you can't touch it. And they're very difficult to reverse. So, similarly, this would be a way of doing that without the bank and maybe making a more complex deal than just the transfer of money.
Exactly, and I guess that it is the reason why if you sell stuff, you might want to use a credit card or debit card instead of people just saying to you, I promise that I will give you €10 or $10 next week, because you kind of know that you will have the money in your bank account. And blockchain is the same. It's the same, actually. If you use blockchain and implement a contract on the blockchain, then you know that no matter what, the contract will be running. So it is a main attractiveness of blockchain. And at the same time, it is a real legal issue, which will create case law in the coming month, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So define for me the difference between a public and private blockchain, and tell me why that distinction is important.
So, as I said, public blockchain really is, in a way, kind of a Excel file. So it's a database, a ledger, and which obviously has been created by one, two, or three users. Then they put it online with a proper functioning system. And that blockchain, if it's a real public blockchain, it could be accessed by anyone. Anyone may write transactions, which is that, for instance, if you take the Bitcoin example, anyone can use Bitcoin and pay using Bitcoin or receive Bitcoin. That transaction is written on the blockchain. And then you have another level, which is when you validate block, which are basically several transactions put together. So on public blockchain, you could do those three things, which is first access the blockchain, write transaction, and validate blocks. And that's basically it. The way they function. So you do have, I don't want to be too technical, but you do have proof of work, proof of stake. It's basically the consensus, which are the rules according to which transactions are verified. And user verify that it is a real transaction, people do exist, and that's basically it. So once you have set up the public blockchain using, for instance, proof of work, then that's it. Nobody controls the blockchain anymore, and everyone can use the blockchain. On the other hand, you have private blockchains, which are created by usually corporations with a real and clear commercial goal. On those blockchains, you can change and you can choose any settings that you prefer. So you might want to say, I want only those 10 users to access the blockchain. Or you can say, I want those 10 users to access the blockchain, and then I'm going to choose some conditions. And if you actually meet the conditions, then you can access the blockchain as well. And you can change those conditions anytime you want. And once you have access to the blockchain as an user, the corporation running that private blockchain can refuse to grant you access anytime. So obviously you see that it could be a way for you to exclude some users which might be competitors to you on another market. So the three levels that you have, which is read the blockchain, write transaction, and validate blocks, that can be designed in a way, in the way that you prefer, and you can change at any time. So that is the real distinction between the two. So basically, for public blockchain, you do not have any pilot on the plane. And for private blockchain is the opposite. You do have one, or it could be 2, 3, 4 corporations running the blockchain. And obviously, what they do is that they run the blockchain, and also they have created an application running on the blockchain. And if you want to use that application, obviously for any transaction that you registered, then you have to pay a small fees, and that's how they make money. So private blockchain really are oriented towards those applications. Some of them are saying we are the best blockchain for a commercial purpose. Some other might say we are the best blockchain if you want to do stuff online, or if you want to do supply agreements, or any kind of activity that you can imagine.
Yeah, so you make the argument in your work that the potential for abuse with a private blockchain is much higher. But on the other hand, it would seem like this problem of not having anyone for the courts to punish in the case of abuse is also mitigated by having a private blockchain, because by reserving the right to make changes, to themselves, these corporations that create the private blockchains are essentially removing that decentralized element, or at least the part of it that matters in this context.
Well, they do, and they do not at the same time. The reason why is because the ledger still is shared, although it is a private blockchain in principle. So it could be the entire ledger or part of it, but the information is accessible. If you compare that to a service outside of the blockchain, let's say if you order a cab, you do not have access to any other transactions other than yours. It isn't true for private blockchain, and even less true for public blockchain, because obviously you can access all transactions ever. And still, you're right that it is easier for courts and authorities to identify authors of anti-competitive practices on private blockchain, because you could say, well, you have created the blockchain, you have changed the way the blockchain functions in a way to eliminate competition, in a way that it is unfair, and so you are liable for that. So it is easier, indeed, to identify users on private blockchain. At least it is easier for you to identify who has created a blockchain and who is changing the rule on the blockchain, because they want to be known, because they provide a commercial service, and obviously they want their brand to be known. At the same time, what you can do on a private blockchain is to say, I'm gonna make my blockchain in a way that all of the transactions are encrypted. So it could be anything. It could be the name of the users. So that become encrypted, and with no possibility to actually know the real identity of those users. It could be the transaction. I want the transaction to be encrypted as well. So it could be the kind of service that was provided, the amount that was paid. It could be basically anything. And if you do design your blockchain that way, then it might become impossible for courts and authorities to do something about it, to identify those practices, authors of those practices, and to do something about it, which is less true for a public blockchain. Usually, transactions are seen. That's the actual reason why public blockchain do exist. It is because you want the ledger to be public. For instance, if you create a public blockchain and you say, as a city or a state, I want all of the properties which are sold to appear on that blockchain. Then if you do that, you want all of the information to be public. Obviously, that's the reason why. So the issues raised by the two kinds of blockchains are really different in terms of liability and way to identify those practices.
Yeah, it's a challenging problem for regulators and for antitrust authorities to deal with this new technology. But one question you address is just, should they? It's sort of a broader discussion, but the antitrust law has this intention of protecting competition in a way, such that a single powerful firm or group of firms can't harm consumers by raising prices and reducing quantity. But in practice, a lot of antitrust cases are brought by the competitors against someone, a firm that is innovating and reducing prices and helping consumers. So I think a lot of people free market inclined economists have been very critical of the way antitrust law has functioned in practice, and so maybe having a system that is less amenable to antitrust law could be a net benefit.
Well, I would say that within the antitrust community, we do have a kind of consensus for merger control and cartels. So cartels could be facilitated by blockchain because you could share information on the blockchain, and that information could be about your prices, it could be about the kind of customer that you have, and that could help you and your competitors to organize the market in a way that is anti-competitive. And usually people and researchers and academics do agree that cartels, if it is, for instance, about price sharing, is bad to the consumer at the end of the day. We do have much less consensus regarding monopolization practices, which are practices in which you have one super powerful company or simply powerful company, because if you do have more than 50% market shares, then you are considered as being in a monopoly. Although I know it is kind of weird for an economist, but it's the way it functions for antitrust. And we do have less consensus about the kind of practices implemented by those single companies, which are good or bad to the consumer. And in a way, within public blockchain, that issue is kind of irrelevant. At least it is today, because as I've said, you have no pilot on the plane. So you do not really have a single company or a single powerful user running the blockchain and choosing a strategy in a way to destroy your competitors. Which is also true is that within those public blockchains, you have what I called a visible effect, which is the fact that everything you do, all of the transactions are public. So you do have less incentive, obviously, to do something which is illegal, which might actually kill or eliminate some of the users on the blockchain if that is public. On the other hand, if that is not public, which is the case usually for private blockchain, then yes, you might want to do something that is anti-competitive. And then you do have one question, which is, all right, we say that that kind of practice is anti-competitive, but can you actually show that in practice the effects on the consumer are really bad? Or is it just a way for you to, well, you basically, what you do is that you qualify the practice, you say that is this type of practice, and we have decided long ago that it is bad for the consumer. Yes, but if you do not show the effects on the consumer on a case-by-case basis, then it creates issues as well, because as you and your listeners may know, anti-competitive fines and sanctions for anti-competitive practices are really, really high, especially in Europe. It could be billions of euros or dollars to pay. So you do have something new, and yet it is the very beginning. But I think it is an argument that will be made, which is that blockchain function in a way that is decentralized. So first, to qualify a monopolization practice is kind of weird, but it could be done within private blockchain. But then can you actually show that the practice that you have seen is really bad for the consumer? And that is one of the main challenges that we will see. And I would say that we are far from having a first blockchain case, because mainly the technology is new. It is not well understood as of today. And I would say that most competition agencies, antitrust agencies, are waiting for blockchain to be developed to understand the technology better before they bring a first case. And yet, I'm very curious to see the kind of justification that they will bring to the table.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts, any sort of final takeaway that listeners should have from this whole topic?
Well, yes. So those are practical issues and issues about, procedural issues and the way it might function. And it is really related to antitrust and competition issues. But also, on the other hand, there is something which is more philosophical in a way, and still really, really important, which is the idea that blockchain is getting popular because it is decentralized. So obviously, not all of the users are using blockchain for a libertarian reason or because it is decentralized. They're using it because it is convenient and it might bring them value. And yet, the reason why it is efficient and it works fine, and I'm sure that it will in the future, is because blockchain is decentralized. So you do have that technology in which really the world is flat. And at the same time, you have all of those agencies and governments, and the way we apply the law and legal matters is very much centralized. We do name one person on top of agencies, and the way it functions is that they impose decision, and it really works as a pyramid. And I wonder about the legitimacy of applying the law as we know it, using agencies as we know it, which are centralized, to a decentralized technology. And in a sense, you could argue, and I am arguing, that you are, by doing so, bringing blockchain back in the old world. So outside of the antitrust world, I think it is important to find a way to give legitimacy back to our institutions. And the best way would be actually to use blockchain. And you do have a lot of companies and developers working on those issues. I was actually really surprised by the growing community working on that, on ways to design institution in a way that is more decentralized indeed. And so you have all of those concepts of futurity, quadratic voting, and many more ways to function. And so I really call specialists for all, whether it is legal issues, economic issues, social issues, to think about that, and maybe to think about how we could decentralize our institutions. And actually, I was kind of surprised talking to some of them that they were not totally against the idea. So it was kind of a nice surprise.
Yeah, it's a really interesting technology, and I look forward to seeing where it goes in the next 5-10 years.
Well, some are saying that it will change our economies. Actually, the some institutions are saying that probably 10% of the total GDP in the world will be stored on blockchain in 10 years. And some other are saying that it will change our societies. And I do believe that. And now the question is it for the better? Well, I think that it is, but it also implies that we think about those issues. And in a way, I don't want, my hope is that technology, which is really amazing, will be regulated. It is the way the world functions, and no matter what we do, regulation will come. So I really do hope that, because we know that, okay, that is a fact, that we will work to find the best regulation to let that technology emerge in the ICANN way that might function.
Yeah, we had an episode here about supersonic air travel, where the regulation was done in a sort of incompetent way, where they wanted to regulate noise, but they regulated speed instead, and that sort of killed the technology. So hopefully, if blockchain is regulated in various ways and by various institutions, it's done in a way that doesn't destroy all the value it could potentially create.
So on that point, if I may, I really see two options. The first is that it might kill the technology, and it might very much happen if we do regulate the core functionalities of blockchain, which will be a big mistake. Or the technology might migrate to other states or the countries. And it is what happened with the bit license. Basically, the state of New York said, if you want to do activities using Bitcoin, then you need a license. Some startups said, well, we don't want to apply for any license, so we will leave the state of New York. Problem is for the state of New York that some of them, weeks after they left, raised millions and millions of dollars. So too bad for the state of New York. It could have been a great tax income for them. So really, you do want to be careful because you could kill blockchain, or you could make that those developers and blockchain will move to other countries. So in a way, it is kind of good because that technology could be used all over the world and it will go where the regulation is the best.
Right. And since it's a decentralized system, I don't necessarily care where it exists physically because I can still interact with it wherever I happen to be as the user.
Exactly. You could be from a small country in Africa. Actually, blockchain is really popular in Africa right now. And if you use Google Trend and type in the word blockchain, you'll see that in African countries, it is where it is the most popular. So you could be from one of those countries and create a blockchain that allows you to organize food supply or other kind of services. And you could do that in Europe or in the United States. And the opposite might be true. You might provide a blockchain that is really useful in the United States, in a small city for any reason. And you could do that in Russia, for instance, or wherever you want. So indeed, you could go anywhere. So really is good in my opinion because it will force regulators to do something that first they understand and first that is good for the technology and the society.
My guest today has been Thibault Schrepel. Thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks a lot.